Well, good morning, good afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching
Hi.
this. Anyway, this
Welcome back.
is Wednesday, what is it, 29th of June this month.
Yes, June is almost
Gone, yeah.
gone.
Got 4th of July coming up next Monday. So,
Woo-hoo.
which reminds me, I tell you this now because I probably forget at the end of the podcast, but we're not going to do a podcast next week. We're going to be taking that week off, got some other things to do,
Yeah.
but anyway, we'll be back the week after that, and hope you have a safe 4th of
Yes,
July.
Yes.
And anyway,
Lots
we're
of
still,
watermelon.
yeah, lots of watermelon. That's always good to eat on 4th of July. And watch the fireworks.
Yeah.
But don't set off too many fireworks in your backyard. It drives the dogs crazy. Anyway.
That's true.
We are in the book of Exodus. We've gotten as far as chapter 20. We just went through 21. We went through chapter 20 last week, which is, of course, the Ten Commandments.
Ten Commandments.
And we talked about in there before, these are things that are good for us. You know, sometimes we have this idea that God doesn't want us to have fun in life, you know, and of course, God's not against us enjoying life. He's just against us doing things that are harmful.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes our idea of fun is is not all that great. You know, I just thinking, if you bought a brand new car and you thought, man, I want to have fun with this car. So how much fun, man, to drive it fast, to do, what do you call it, donuts with it, and, you know, to take off from stop traffic lights like a jackrabbit and just all kinds of stuff like that. But you find out pretty quick, might be fun for a little while, but it pretty quickly destroys your vehicle.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of things that we think are fun in life are destructive, first of all, to our physical body, but also destructive to relationships, destructive to just living a good life, living a peaceful life with people. And so these things are things that God He's the maker. You know, He's our creator. He knows how we operate. He knows what's best for us. And so He's given us plans here on how to live. And you go through the Ten Commandments, and as we said last week, and I know I'm repeating some things, but I think it's important to repeat that these are all based on love. Because God loves us and He wants us to have the best in life.
Yes.
And Jesus, remember, in a couple of different places said that the whole law rests on 2 commandments, and those both have to do with love.
That's
First
right.
of all is love the Lord your
Love
God,
the
all your
Lord.
heart, all your mind, all your strength, and
love people.
love the people. Love your neighbor as you love
Yeah.
yourself. Says if you'll do those 2 things, you don't have to worry about all the rest. You'll do them. You'll do all the other things. But they just God kind of gives us a guideline. And of course, Paul also wrote, he said the law was given to show us basically how far we come short of what God expects. He says if there was no law, there would be no sin. We wouldn't know what was sin. If we didn't have laws in this country, how would you know you were breaking the law? Well, you got to have laws to guide you. But if everybody was self-controlled and went by those 2 commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbors yourself, we wouldn't need all the myriad of laws that we have.
Yeah.
Why do we keep enacting new laws? Because people find new ways to go against society. You know, we didn't, like I think I mentioned this last week, we didn't have to have laws at one time about internet theft and fraud and identity theft, because that wasn't a problem. But once we got the internet and all these things, right, people found ways to misuse it.
And don't you think God knew that? He knows the
Sure,
nature
He knew
of
that.
man.
He knows the nature of man. He knows that,
Yes.
you know, everything in this, basically, pretty much everything in this world was created for good, but man finds a way to turn it for bad, turn it to evil, make personal gain out of it, or something, you know, turning it perverting it. And this is what the law was to try and prevent, to tell people this is the way you should act.
That's right. This is the right way to live,
Yeah.
according to God's word.
And so after the 10 Commandments, we get a lot more laws, and we're not going to go into all of them in detail, but these were guides for living. Guides for living,
Yeah.
first of all, being faithful to God, but also how to get along with other people. And it's interesting, the first thing he starts talking about before, or after, after the 10 Commandments is basically slavery.
Yeah.
Some Bibles it talks about servants, but it's more than just like a hired servant, like your butler or somebody like that, but it's a form of slavery. And it starts off, in verse 1, it says, "These are the laws you're to set before them." These are God talking to Moses. These are the laws that I want you to set before the people. "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he's to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he's to go free alone. If he has a wife when he comes, she's to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children still belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, 'I love my master, my wife, my children,' do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He'll take him to the doorpost, or the doorpost, pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be a servant for life." And it goes on to give some other instructions concerning servants, or again, it could be translated slaves. And unfortunately, people in the past, when slavery was an issue in this country, used the Bible to condone slavery, actually to defend slavery. To me, the odd or the ironic thing about it is they used the Bible to defend slavery. Said, well, God talked about how to gave regulation for slavery, but the type of slavery we practiced in this country, with just using one race, basically they defended that with Darwinism, with evolution, because they claimed, well, that race was not as evolved as the white race was, and that was their excuse for keeping them enslaved. They were not as highly evolved, and they were closer to animals, and all this garbage that a lot of them use. So at the same time they're using the Bible, they're using Darwinism, which is contrary to the Bible, to defend slavery. Well, why didn't God just say, don't do this, don't have slaves? Well, for one thing, the slavery that they practiced in those days was totally different than what was practiced in this nation and practiced in most nations today. There's still a few nations that do have slavery, but it was totally different. A lot of these servants or slaves were people that sold themselves into slavery because of financial conditions. They gotten themselves into such a condition financially that the only way out of it was to sell themselves to a person, basically as a bonder, indentured servanthood, and that was the way they paid off their debt. But you see, God set limits on it here. First of all, he said you're to serve for 6 years. The 7th year, you let them go. And it goes on and says, if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she's not to be sold to a foreigner. If the owner selects her for his son and she marries his son, then he has to treat her just like a daughter. And there's just all kinds of different things here. Later on, you'll see that if they're injured, if they hit their slave to where they hurt him, well, then there's indemnity that has to be paid. So there's regulations for it here. It's not just that. It's not the kind of slavery that was practiced in this country, where basically they were just treated as an object, as a possession. That they had absolutely no rights at all. But there were rights that these servants, these slaves, whatever you want to call them, they had certain rights. And they weren't treated, like I say, like things or objects just as possession, but they were to be treated as people. They were to be treated, with dignity. God preserved the personal rights and the dignity even of these poor people. And so it was important. It's important to understand this. God never condoned the type of slavery that was practiced in this country, whereas, like say, one particular race and where they had absolutely no rights at all. They could do anything they wanted with them. They were just, like say, just treated like animals. So there has to be, there had to be certain regulations. And then it goes on here and it talks about personal injuries. If someone strikes a person with a fatal blow, anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it's not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they're to flee to a place all designated. So later on, when they went into the land, there were refuge cities where somebody that accidentally killed somebody could flee to protect him until the case was heard, so that relatives or friends couldn't take revenge on them. But that goes on here and talks about different things. Attacking anyone who attacks their father and mother is to be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death. Going back to the 10 Commandments, I mentioned this last week where it said, "Thou shalt not murder." That didn't do away with capital punishment, which, I'm not going one way or the other on that. I'm not saying I'm for it or I'm saying against it, but I'm just saying that God didn't because God said don't murder. It's talking about individuals taking a life, but society as a whole has that right to take somebody's life if they feel that the crime that they committed is egregious enough. And so it gives several reasons here: for murder, for somebody attacks their parents, for somebody kidnaps somebody. Of course, in that day, usually kidnapping was not done for ransom, but it was done to sell them into slavery.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that kind of kidnapping takes place today, especially in the sex trade and the human trafficking, where they're kidnapped and sold. Usually into the sex trade. Sometimes it can be to make slaves out of in other ways, but generally it's like say for the sex trade. So there's compensation there where it goes down and talks about eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that was putting limitations. Sometimes we think that's talking about vengeance, but it's putting limitations. In other words, you don't punish a person beyond what the damage they did. You can't do excessive punishment is basically what I think it's talking about here. And it goes on and talks about animals even, where it talks about if an animal gores a person to death, the animal was to be stoned to death. But the owner's not to be held responsible. However, if that bull had a habit of it, if he'd done this before and been known to be vicious or ornery, and the owner didn't take care of it properly, didn't keep it tied up or fenced up, and he gored somebody, then not only was the bull put to death, but the owner was to be put to death. These are just all, to me, common sense things. You make people responsible.
Yeah.
If you got an animal that you don't know is vicious and it attacks somebody, you do take care of the animal, but you don't necessarily hold the owner responsible. But if the owner knows that animal is vicious, he's attacked somebody before, or he's shown to be a very vicious animal and he doesn't do anything about it, then the owner's to be held responsible as well as the animal.
Yeah.
And again, most of these things are just common sense. You'd think we ought to know this. It's just rules and regulations, because otherwise how do we settle arguments? What happens if, something like this happens? What's the right thing to do? Well, the Bible tells us here. And there's other applications, these can be brought into broader application. Here it keeps talking about a bull goring somebody or goring another animal. But it could be any kind of animal. If a horse attacks somebody or, stomps on somebody, and a dog attacks somebody, it's the same principle. If the owner was not aware of it, then the owner's not held responsible. But if the owner knew about it, the same thing.
Same thing.
It talks about somebody leaves a pit uncovered, and digs a pit and fails to cover it up, and somebody's animal falls in it.
Yeah.
They're responsible for covering the loss. The person that dug the pit and didn't cover it. Just, again, common sense.
Yeah, it is.
You don't dig a pit, and of course, in this case, it's probably talking about cisterns, because they dug cisterns quite often in those days to store water in. And if you dug a big pit and just left it wide open and an animal falls in it and gets injured or killed, you're responsible for it. In other words, you just take precaution. These, like I say, are just common sense rules. Then chapter 22, we get into protection of property. Somebody steals an ox or sheep and slaughters it and sells it, he's got to pay back five cattle for the ox, 4 sheep for the sheep. In other words, they got to pay back more than they stole. Why? To teach them there's consequences of our actions. Goes on, and anyone who steals, this is in verse 2, or verse 3 rather, anyone who steals has to make restitution.
Yeah.
But if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay for their theft. In other words, if they steal something and they've gotten rid of it and they've already spent the money, then since they can't make restitution, then they're sold into slavery. But again, the same principles would apply to them that applies to any other slave. They can only be a slave for 6 years, and they still have rights even as that slave. If they steal an animal and it's found alive in their possession, they have to pay back double. If you let your animals go and graze in somebody else's field, you have to make restitution for what they ate. All these things. If a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes so that burns shocks of grain or standing grain, the person that started the fire has to be responsible. In other words, if you're burning off some trash or burning off a field and you don't keep a close eye on it and it goes and burns up somebody's wheat field, you got to make restitution for it. Again, just common sense. I don't want to go through every one of these, but they're just, like I say, they're common sense things. What do you do in the case of these things happen,
Yeah.
If somebody, if a neighbor, this is verse 7, if anyone gives a neighbor silver or gold for safekeeping and they're stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judge, and they must determine whether the owner of the house had laid hands on the person's property. In other words, if you claim, somebody gave you something for safekeeping and you claim it was stolen and they can't find the thief, then you gotta go before a judge to make sure you're not the thief.
Yeah.
It really was stolen, that you didn't steal it. All these things that, like I say, are just common sense. Let's go on down. If anyone, verse 14, if anyone borrows an animal from their neighbor, it's injured or dies while the owner's not present, they must make restitution. So if you go to your neighbor, and of course in this case it might say you go and borrow their car, and it breaks down while you're driving, then really you should be responsible for it. You might say, well, probably would have broke down anyway. Well, maybe so, but it's only right to make restitution. If it was hired, if you're, renting it, then that's a different situation. You're paying money for it, and then the money paid for the hire covers it. There's social responsibility. If a man seduces a virgin, verse 15, who's not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he still must pay the bride price. If somebody seduces a woman, that he's responsible. How lax have we gotten on this today? I mean, it's sad that this is, I don't know how to say it. It's just we've gotten so lax in that area of morality today. And I'm not for going back to the old Victorian days. I know people say, well, Christians, want to go back to the Victorian days and get so rigid and prudish, but I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there needs to be some morality. That sex before marriage is not the unforgivable sin, but on the other hand, it's not God's ideal either. And it causes a lot of heartache, a lot of heartbreak, unwanted children, diseases, all kinds of different things. God gave us these rules for a purpose, for our good, not for our, to deprive us of anything, but to protect us, and to help us to live a good life.
Yes.
We go on down here. Don't mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I don't know, I guess this would kind of deal with the immigration problem we have now. I believe there have to be immigration laws, there have to be regulations, but just because someone enters this country illegally doesn't give us the right as individuals to mistreat that person. That's up to the government to deal with them. It's not up to us to mistreat them and say, well, he's got no right here. We have the right to abuse him or whatever. Even in cheating of them wages, a lot of them, because they're not here legally, people take advantage of them and just don't pay them hardly anything, pay them very low wages. Well, that's not how we're to treat foreigners. If we're going to hire them, then you pay them a good wage. I know this may sound political, but it's not political. It's just common sense. It's the right thing to do. It's the godly thing to do. Don't take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. So often, we don't see it so much anymore, but used to, when they would print addresses and so forth in obituaries, why people would take advantage of widows in their grief, and people still try to, through email scams, try to take advantage, especially of the elderly, try to scare them into doing things, with these calls you hear about with people claiming to be from the government, and if they don't send them money, they're going to go to jail, or claiming to be their grandson and they got thrown in jail or something and they need some money, and all these things. These are things that, that God is totally opposed to. He says, if you do take advantage of the widow or the fatherless and they cry out to me, I'll certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I'll kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows and your children fatherless. Well, I'd say to some telemarketers, you better watch out, because if these people happen to be Christians that you scam and they cry out to God, God says, I'll get vengeance on you. So watch out, you scammers, if anybody happens to be watching that's thinking about scamming.
God is a God of justice and order.
That's true. So, anyway, got a phone call coming in the background, but we'll ignore that. What else? Don't hold back your offering. Don't blaspheme God. Curse the rulers. You must give me the firstborn. We talked about this earlier, that God consecrated the firstborn of the children, the firstborn of the animals. He said, let them stay with their mothers for 7 days. Give them to me on the 8th day. You're to be my holy people.
Yes.
And so God's setting all these rules and regulations, if you want to call them that. I call them guidelines, really. Guidelines or guardrails to keep people out of trouble, really. Let's go on in chapter 23. We'll kind of skim through these because, like I say, I don't want to go through all of these point by point, but just to realize that this law was not harsh. There was some things, concerning the religious part of it that we don't have to follow anymore, but the rest of it was just things that are common sense, things that are good for us.
Mm-hmm.
Don't spread, chapter 23, verse 1, don't spread false reports.
Yeah.
Don't lie, don't gossip. Don't help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. In other words, don't lie for somebody that you know is guilty.
Yeah.
Or, on the other hand, don't lie for them to get them off. If you know they're guilty and you saw them do something, you don't lie about that either. Don't follow the crowd in doing wrong. Oh, that is so powerful.
It is.
How many people get into trouble by following the crowd? Oh, you're a chicken if you don't do this, I don't know if they use the term chicken anymore, but anyway, people, pressure, especially when teenagers, that kids will talk other kids into doing anything just to prove they're a man or just to prove they're cool or whatever it is,
Yeah.
Don't follow other people in doing wrong. If you get labeled as a nerd or uncool or whatever, I don't even know what the terms are they use nowadays, but it's better to do that than to get into trouble.
Yeah.
And I've seen when I was younger, and especially in college, I saw several people get into serious trouble just because somebody talked them into going along with what they were doing, and they knew it was wrong. So it goes on along same vein. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, don't pervert justice by siding with a crowd. Don't show favor to a poor person in a lawsuit. On the other hand, don't show favoritism to a rich person. Don't let their economic status change your testimony, change your word. You tell the truth. If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. Don't say, that's not my animal, I don't care, and that's old, what's his name? I don't even like him, so I'm just going to let him go. Don't do that. You don't treat your enemies even that way. Don't deny justice to your poor people. Have nothing to do with a false charge. Don't put an innocent or honest person to death. Don't accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Again, don't oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. Is just kind of repeating what he said earlier. You don't oppress people just because they're a foreigner. And we see, unfortunately, a lot of that in this country. People that turn against people of a certain race. We have an act of terrorism, and maybe there's people living peacefully in this nation that they're only, I don't want to say crime, but the only thing that's ties them to it is the fact they happen to be maybe of the same nationality of those people that committed the terrorism, and people target them and blame them. That's not God's way. That's not God's way. As Christians, we don't act that way. We don't treat foreigners that way. God talks about the Sabbath laws, and we already talked about the Sabbath day, that on the seventh day, why they're to rest. But this talks about resting your fields on the seventh year. Let the land lie unplowed and unused, and then the poor among your people may get food from it. But this is like a Sabbath year. 6 days do you work, on the seventh day don't work.
Mm-hmm.
Let your ox and your donkey may rest, so that you may rest. So the foreigner, so that your slave, your servants may rest. It's just to give people a time of rest.
Yeah.
And the seventh year was a time to let the land rest. It's just, good for the land, especially in those days when they didn't have the advantage of fertilizers and things like that could improve the land and enrich the land. Why, it was just good sense to let it rest for a time. Then he talks about the festivals there to celebrate.
Yeah.
Verse 15, it says the festival of unleavened bread. This is, of course, the Passover time when they came out of Egypt. Then the festival of harvest,
Mm-hmm.
when the first fruits, you bring the first fruits of the crop.
Yep.
And then the festival of gathering at the end of the year, after you've
Mm-hmm.
gathered the last of the crops. 3 times a year. Yeah, it's like Thanksgiving. 3 times a year, the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. These were just times of remembrance.
Yeah.
And we do the same thing. We have Christmas. And that's to celebrate what God gave us in the form of Jesus, what God gave us by sending Jesus as the Savior. And of course, Easter. What's the purpose of Easter? It's not just for Easter egg hunts.
No.
I mean, that's fine for kids to have that, but to remember the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. Without Easter, Christmas would be meaningless. So it's just... these are times that we're to remember what God has done. And we're to bring, this talks about bringing the best of your first fruits to the house, into the house of God. Well, our fruit is, in Hebrews, it talks about bringing or giving the fruit of our lips, offering thanks unto God. The first fruits that we offer is the fruit of our mouth, our praise, our worship to God. And it's, again, all these things are just instructions. First of all, to be pleasing to God, but also to get along with your fellow man, to get along with other people. And then God ends up in this chapter, he talks about he's going to send an angel ahead of him to prepare the way, to bring you to the place I've prepared for you. And for them, it was a land. It was a place of settling down, a place of rest where they'd have their own land. They wouldn't live in somebody else's on somebody else's land, but would have on their own land. And my angel in verse 23 will go ahead of you and bring you into the land of all these people: Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, etc.
All the ites.
And but he says, when you get in there, don't bow down before their gods or worship them or follow their practices. But worship the Lord your God and his blessings. Well, what is our promised land today? It's resting in Jesus. Yeah. It's not a piece of property. It's not a particular land. I mean, I love this nation, but this nation is not the promised land. No. It's not the Holy Land. The Holy Land today is in our heart. You know, we still refer to Israel and Jerusalem as a holy land, but really the Holy Land is in our hearts. That's where God resides now, is in our hearts. And that's the promised land for us, is that rest that we have in Jesus. And God promises that he's going to take care of them. He said, I'll send, verse 27, I'll send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. I'll make your enemies turn their backs and run. I'll send a hornet ahead of you to drive them out.
Yeah. The heavenly hornet.
God does the same thing today, but not to people, Because our enemy today isn't people. God said, we don't fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And so I believe the same thing. That God sends his terror ahead of us to throw into confusion the enemy, the devil, and his cohorts. Make your enemies, the devil and his cohorts, turn their backs and run from you. And so this promise was specifically made to the Israelites to lead them into the promised land, but I believe that promise is still today for us, for our enemies that we have to drive out. Mm-hmm. And again, the enemies that we drive out is the devil and his lying demons. And he talks about his establishing his border. It says in verse 29, I'll not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and the wild animals too numerous for you. But little by little I'll drive them out. So we don't overnight become totally sanctified. It's little by little. God works in our life and sets us free from different areas, different things in our lives.
It's like when we first get saved, that doesn't mean you're going to come out instantly cleansed of everything, and all of your habits.
Yeah, all your habits, all your wrong thoughts, all your wrong actions. Yeah. Is little by little.
Little by little.
And the thing is, you keep working at it.
Yes, you do.
You don't quit. Sometimes we get discouraged because it seems like, here I've been saved for 3 years now and I'm still fighting with this habit. Well, it's just little by little. God begins to drive out the enemy until you get to that place of being totally set free. And he says, here it says, I'll establish your borders from the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and so forth. But our borders are walking in the ways of God.
Yes.
It's not a physical border, but our borders are the boundaries that God sets on our conduct, our way of life. And we're to, again, he warns them, don't worship their gods.
Right.
Don't let those people, it says, don't let them live in your land or they'll cause you to sin against me, because the worship of their gods will certainly be a snare to you. If we don't deal with these things in our lives, they tend to come back and draw us back in, suck us back in. We need to get rid of the things in our life that draw us in the wrong direction. So all these laws, again, they're not to hinder us, but they're to set us free. They're to help us live the kind of life that God wants us to live. Jesus said, the thief is the one that came to steal, kill, and destroy, but I came to give you life, and that life in abundance. And the only way to live that kind of abundant life is living God's way, living according to God's plan. And all these, later on, the religious ceremonies that they went through, or we're not bound by those, but as far as the moral laws and these other laws we're talking about, these are just common sense laws and laws that just help us to get along with other people.
Yeah.
God wants us to be able to have good relationships with other people, and that's why he gave us all of these things. That's why he gave us these laws. So we'll end there at the end of chapter 23 and go on. Like I say, we'll skip through a lot of these things fairly fast, because there's we don't need to go through every single thing, and we're going to get into the tabernacle pretty soon, and we won't go through every single
no, because it's very involved.
Yes, very involved. We won't go through every single detail of the tabernacle, but there's symbolism there. And I think it's good to understand the symbolism of the tabernacle as we get into that. But again, it's important to understand the importance of the law. That this is just not some something that God just sought up on the spur of the moment. But these are things that God says, this is the way. If you want to live a good life, this is what you need to do. So, all right. Well, we'll end there.
Okay.
And remind you again, we won't be doing a podcast next week. So if you look for it next week, you're going to miss it. But we'll be back the week after that, and we'll get into further things and probably get into talking about the tabernacle some that they built out in the wilderness. So, all right. Well, we just wish you a good week. And
Happy 4th of July.
That's right. Have a good, safe 4th of July. And hope you get to get together with some family and just have a good time.
Yes.
God bless, and
God
we'll
bless you all.
see you in a couple of weeks.